Kingship descended from heaven. What if the oldest record of power on earth was never mythology at all? What if it was an audit? Somewhere in Oxford, behind a panel of protective glass, sits an object that most people walk past without stopping. It is small enough to hold in one hand. It is made of baked clay. It is the colour of dried blood, and pressed into its four sides in wedge-shaped marks that have survived 4,000 years of silence is a list, not a poem, not a prayer, a list of names, cities, dynasties, and numbers so precise and so impossible that scholars have spent a century arguing about what to do with them. The Weld-Blundell Prism, catalogue number AN9923.4, 8 inches tall, recovered from the dust near the ancient city of Larsa in southern Iraq in 1922. And on its surface, in 400 lines of cuneiform, a declaration that opens like a door onto something we have not yet fully understood. Kingship descended from heaven. Tonight, we are going to sit with those 4 words for a very long time. We are going to turn them over slowly, the way you might turn a clay tablet in your hands, feeling the weight of it, tracing the edges, letting the coolness of the surface settle against your palm. We are going to follow the thread of that declaration from its origin in the river mud of ancient Mesopotamia, through flood layers and royal tombs and fractional genealogies, all the way to the present. And by the time we are done, you may find that the question is not whether this is mythology. The question is whether we have been reading it wrong. Settle in. The archive is open, and the night is long. Before we go further, if you find yourself drawn to the kind of history that refuses to stay in its official categories, consider subscribing to this channel. And if you are listening in the dark right now, wherever you are in the world, drop a comment telling me what time it is where you are. I want to imagine this silence stretching across the globe, all of us gathered around the same clay tablet, separated by thousands of miles, but drawn to the same ancient question. Let us begin with the object itself, because the object matters. When you stand in front of the Weld-Blundell Prism in the Ashmolean Museum, what you are looking at is not a decorative piece. It was never meant to be beautiful. The Sumerians, the people who pressed these marks into wet clay somewhere around 2100 BCE, were not artists in the way we typically use that word. They were administrators, accountants, record keepers of extraordinary precision. The civilization that produced this prism also produced the world's first writing system, and they invented writing not to compose literature, not to praise the gods in lyric verse, but to track barley, to count sheep, to record the transfer of goods from one hand to another. They needed a technology of permanence for the most practical of reasons, and clay gave them exactly that. So when these same people, these obsessive documentarians of the material world, turned their reed styluses toward the question of political power and legitimate rule, they brought the same cold mathematical precision they applied to grain inventories. They were not writing mythology, they were writing an official record, and the official record begins with that single line. Nam Lugal Anta, kingship descended from heaven. The Sumerian word for descent here is the same verb they used in warehouse receipts. Barley descended from the storehouse to the workers. A physical transfer, a movement of something material from one location to another. The people who wrote this were not speaking in metaphor. They were describing in the most literal language available to them, a transfer of something real from somewhere above to somewhere below. An institution, a rite, a substance, something that could be tracked, recorded, and passed from one holder to the next with the same precision they applied to everything else. And then the list begins. Kingship landed in Eridu, the first city, the oldest city. And in Eridu, 8 kings ruled before a catastrophe ended everything. Imagine for a moment what Eridu looked like. It sits now beneath a low mound in the southern Iraqi desert, a place of silence and dust, and the occasional archaeologist picking carefully through what time has compressed into layers. But in the period the king list describes, it was something else entirely. It was built on the edge of a vast freshwater lake, surrounded by marshland, the kind of place where the boundary between water and land was never quite certain, where the reeds grew tall and the air smelled of mud and green things, and the particular richness of a world that had not yet been fully organized. The temples of Eridu were among the oldest structures on Earth. Excavations at the site uncovered 18 successive temple layers, each one built directly on top of the last, going down and down into the earth like a vertical record of accumulated devotion. The oldest of them, at the very bottom of that stack, dates to somewhere around 5400 BCE. A small room, an offering table, the bones of fish left as gifts to something that was understood to be present in that specific place. That is what Eridu was, the first city, the place where the sacred and the administrative first came together in a single location. And it is where the king list says kingship first landed. Here is where the numbers appear, and here is where modern scholarship tends to look away. Al-Ulim ruled Eridu for 28,800 years. Alalga sat on the throne for 36,000 years. Enmen-Luana ruled Bad Tibira for 43,200 years. Dumuzid, the shepherd, ruled for 36,000 years. 8 kings, a total of 241,200 years of kingship before the flood swept everything away. The standard scholarly response to these numbers is that they are symbolic, inflated for effect, designed to impress. And perhaps that is true. But before we accept that explanation, we need to sit with something that the standard response tends to skip over. The Sumerians were not dreamers. They were not given to casual exaggeration in their official documents. We have thousands of clay tablets proving they could calculate compound interest. They tracked the movements of planets with a precision that European astronomy would not match for another 2,000 years. The Plimpton 322 tablet, sitting today at Columbia University, contains a table of Pythagorean triples that predates Pythagoras by over 1,000 years. These were people who understood mathematics as a sacred discipline, a way of perceiving the underlying structure of reality. They did not make numerical errors in their official records. They did not round up casually. They did not exaggerate in documents meant to serve as legal and administrative foundations for political authority. And look more carefully at those numbers. They are not random. They are not inflated. They are precise multiples of 3,1600, the Sumerian unit called the Sar, which forms the core of the base 60 numerical system you are still using today every time you glance at a clock. Al-Ulim's 28,800 years is exactly 8 Sar. Alalga's 36,000 years is exactly 10 Sa. The 43,200 years is exactly 12 Sa. This is not mythology. This is a mathematical structure, cold, tightly wound, internally consistent. And here is the detail that should stop you completely. These numbers are not unique to the Weld-Blundell Prism. They appear verbatim on multiple independent fragments from different cities, different periods, different scribal traditions. From Nippur to collections in the British Museum, the numbers are identical. Myths change as they travel. Stories shift with each telling. But these numbers do not change. They are locked, fixed, maintained with the same rigidity as a legal contract. There is a fragment in the collection of the Iraq Museum in Baghdad, damaged and incomplete, that nevertheless preserves enough of the pre-flood king list to confirm the same figures. There is a tablet from Nippur, the great religious center of ancient Mesopotamia, that scholars catalogued in the early 20th century, and which contains the same sequence of names and the same impossible reigns. There are fragments from the ancient city of Isin, from the period of its own dynasty, that copy the list with the same fidelity. When you lay these fragments side by side, when you compare the numbers across 5 different sources from 5 different cities and 5 different centuries, the consistency is not the consistency of mythology. It is the consistency of a document that scribes understood they were not permitted to alter. So the question is not whether the Sumerians were exaggerating. The question is what they were actually recording. If this kind of history keeps you awake at night, go ahead and like this video so others who are searching for it can find their way here too. Perhaps the numbers represent astronomical cycles rather than biological lifespans. Perhaps each king's reign is measured in the cycles of some celestial body we have not yet identified as their unit of reference. The number 43,200 is particularly interesting in this regard. It appears not only in the Sumerian king list, but in the dimensions of the Great Pyramid at Giza, where the ratio of the pyramid's height to its base perimeter mirrors the ratio of the Earth's polar radius to its equatorial circumference by a factor of 43,200. Whether this is coincidence or evidence of a shared mathematical vocabulary across ancient civilizations is a question that remains genuinely open. The same number appears in the Hindu tradition, where the Kali Yuga, the current age of the world, is said to last 432,000 years, a tenfold multiple. The same base number, scaled differently, appearing in traditions separated by thousands of miles and apparently independent development. Perhaps the numbers encode the lifespan of an institution bearing that king's name, rather than the biological life of a single individual. Perhaps each reign represents a dynasty that held power under a single royal name, the way the Egyptians sometimes counted the reign of a god rather than a mortal king. Or perhaps, and this is the possibility that deserves the most careful consideration, our understanding of what human history looked like before 3000 BCE is far more incomplete than we typically acknowledge. We will hold all of these possibilities gently, the way you hold something fragile in both hands, not gripping too tightly, not letting go. Because then, at a precise point in the list, everything changes. 3 words in Sumerian, a mere 3 words, and they carry the weight of everything. The flood swept over. The rhythmic catalogue of kings and cities and impossibly long reigns simply stops. And in the silence that follows those 3 words, we are meant to understand that the world as it had existed was gone. Not transformed, not changed, gone. Beneath water, beneath mud, beneath a silence so complete that when the waters finally receded, the scribes who came after had to begin the list again from the beginning. And this is where the Sumerian king list stops being an administrative curiosity and becomes something that demands a different quality of attention. Because the flood is not mythology. In the 1920s and 1930s, archaeologists excavating the ancient Sumerian cities of Shuruppak and Kish encountered something they had not expected. Digging through successive layers of human habitation, they hit a wall. Not a wall of stone or brick, but a wall of mud. Sterile alluvial sediment, 8 to 11 feet thick in some places, wedged between occupation layers with no artifacts, no bones, no evidence of human presence whatsoever. Beneath the mud, the pottery and tools of one civilization. Above the mud, the remains of a different civilization. Between them, nothing but the cold silt deposited by massive standing water. When Leonard Woolley excavated the royal cemetery at Ur in 1929, he initially thought he had reached virgin soil, the undisturbed earth beneath any human habitation. But then his team dug deeper, and another occupation layer appeared beneath that sterile mud. His workers looked at it and knew immediately what it was. They had a word for it in Arabic. They called it the flood. Not a flood, the flood. The specific event they had grown up hearing about in the traditions that had been transmitted through their culture from the Sumerian and Babylonian originals. They recognized it not from a textbook, but from memory, from the deep cultural inheritance that had preserved the knowledge of this catastrophe across 5,000 years of oral and written transmission. Carbon dating placed this catastrophe at roughly 2900 BCE, not a global flood. Geology does not support that, but a localized mega flood of extraordinary violence in the southern Mesopotamian floodplain, where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers burst their banks and swallowed the entire alluvial plain for months. For the people living there, for the civilization that had built Eridu and Shuruppak and the other pre-flood cities, the world had literally ended. The mud layer is the physical evidence of that ending. It is the geological confirmation of 3 words pressed into clay. The flood swept over, and then the list continues. After the water receded, after the mud settled, after whatever had been swallowed stayed swallowed, the text records something that should give you a moment of pause. Kingship descended from heaven again. The same language, the same verb, the same transfer from above to below. Whatever had sent the institution of rulership down to earth the first time, whatever force or principle or entity had initiated that original transfer, it came back and did it a second time. The system rebooted, and the new center of power was not Eridu. The first city was gone, buried under mud and memory. The center moved north to the city of Kish. And here is where the list becomes truly strange, because the numbers begin to change. The post-flood kings still live extraordinarily long lives by our standards. The first king of Kish ruled for 1,200 years, but that is already a fraction of the pre-flood figures. And then the numbers begin to fall. The next king ruled for 900 years. Then Then the numbers continue their descent. slowly, generation by generation, until they reach something approaching the human scale we recognize. Now consider what this means if you take the numbers seriously rather than dismissing them. If the inflated numbers were simply propaganda designed to make rulers seem more impressive, why would the scribes allow them to decrease? Why not maintain the fiction at its most impressive level? Why record a systematic decline? There is no propagandistic reason to document the diminishment of your ruler's divine credentials over time. If anything, the logic of propaganda runs in the opposite direction. Propaganda inflates. It does not document a slow and steady reduction toward ordinary human scale. The fact that the numbers fall, that they fall consistently, that they fall in a pattern that mirrors the dilution of a concentrated substance across generations. This is not the behavior of invented mythology. This is the behavior of a record that is tracking something real. But if the numbers were recording something real, something that was actually declining, the picture looks entirely different. The post-flood kings were, according to the tradition, descendants of the pre-flood elite. The survivors, the people who carried within them whatever quality or substance had defined the original rulers, those who had received kingship directly from its divine source. And that substance, whatever it was diluting, mixing with ordinary human inheritance, becoming, generation by generation, less concentrated. The Sumerians had a word for this quality. They called it me, sometimes translated as divine powers, sometimes as the fundamental properties of civilization. The me were not abstract virtues. They were specific things, enumerated in lists with the same precision applied to everything else. Kingship was one of them, descent into the underworld, the priestly offices, the scribal arts, the craft of the smith, the craft of the leather worker, the art of music, the art of heroship. These were not metaphors, they were real properties of the world that could be held, transferred, stolen, lost, and recovered. And the ruling families were the custodians of the most important of them. There is a Sumerian myth called Inanna and Enki, in which the goddess Inanna travels to the city of Eridu to obtain the moi from Enki, the god of wisdom. She arrives at his temple. He gives her beer, and in the course of their drinking, he gives her the me, one by one, transferring them from his custody to hers. The story is told with the specificity of a legal transaction, each me named and transferred in sequence, as though the scribe recording it was documenting a change of ownership. When Enki sobers up and realizes what he has given away, he sends his servants to retrieve them, but the transfer is already complete. The me are already in Inanna's possession. And the point of the story is not that Enki was tricked. The point is that the me are transferable. They are objects. They can be given and received and carried and held. They are not metaphors for virtue or wisdom. They are things. What the declining numbers in the king list may be recording is the dilution of that custodianship, the gradual mixing of a concentrated inheritance with the broader human gene pool until what had once been measured in tens of thousands of years could no longer sustain itself beyond a normal human lifespan. This is a remarkable thing to find in an administrative document, and it raises a question that the document itself seems to anticipate. What was being diluted? I want to pause here and ask you something. If you have encountered similar patterns In other ancient texts, other traditions where divine substance or sacred bloodlines are tracked with this kind of mathematical precision, leave that in the comments. The archive is always listening, and those connections matter more than you might think. Imagine for a moment that you are a scribe in a Mesopotamian city sometime around 2100 BCE. Your job is to compile and maintain the official record of kingship. You have access to older tablets, older lists, fragments from before the flood. You are not inventing this record. You are copying it, preserving it, maintaining its integrity across generations. And in the older fragments, you find these numbers, these impossible, mathematically precise, internally consistent numbers that describe a world before the catastrophe, a world where the rulers were something other than what rulers are now. You do not dismiss them. You are a Sumerian accountant. You trust the numbers. You copy them faithfully. And you include the note about the declining lifespans of the post-flood kings, because that is part of the record too. The record of a process, the record of a change. You do not editorialize, you do not add a note explaining what the numbers mean or whether you believe them. You press them into clay exactly as you found them in the older fragments, because your job is not to interpret the record. Your job is to preserve it. And in preserving it, you are doing something that the people who made the original record clearly intended. You are transmitting. You are carrying the information forward across time in the most permanent medium available, trusting that whoever receives it on the other end will have the patience to sit with it long enough to understand what it is saying. The question of what that change was recording is one that archaeology, genetics, and ancient history are still circling around, approaching from different angles, never quite arriving at a consensus. But the traditions themselves are quite specific about what they believed was being diluted. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the most complete work of literature to survive from ancient Mesopotamia, the hero's divine credentials are given with the same mathematical precision as the king list. Gilgamesh was 2/3 divine and 1/3 human. His father was the king Lugalbanda, a demigod. His mother was the goddess Ninsun, fully divine. The fraction is not decorative language. It is not a poetic way of saying he was very impressive. In the context of a civilization that applied precise fractions to everything from grain rations to astronomical calculations, 2/3 divine and 1/3 human is a measurement. It is a description of a ratio. If divinity were not, in the Sumerian understanding, a biological substance that could be inherited, measured, and quantified, what would that fraction mean? How do you calculate 2/3 of a metaphor? The Epic of Gilgamesh is one of the oldest complete narratives in human existence. The most complete version we have was recovered from the library of the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, where it was stored on 12 clay tablets in a collection of tens of thousands of texts that Ashurbanipal had assembled from across the ancient world. He was, by all accounts, the most literate king in Mesopotamian history, a man who could read in multiple languages and who understood that the preservation of written knowledge was itself a form of power. When his library was excavated in the 19th century by Austin Henry Layard and his successors, the tablets were found smashed and scattered, the result of the Babylonian sack of Nineveh in 612 BCE. but they had been preserved by the fire that destroyed the palace. The clay tablets were fired hard by the burning building, and they survived when everything else perished. Catastrophe had, once again, preserved what it might have destroyed. Gilgamesh's story is, at its core, the story of a being who is caught between two natures. His divine inheritance makes him extraordinary. His human inheritance makes him mortal. And the tragedy of the epic is his inability to accept that the old world, the world where even the gods' genetics could sustain indefinite life, is over. He seeks out Utnapishtim, the flood survivor, the Sumerian Noah, the one man who was granted immortality after the catastrophe. And Utnapishtim tells him in essence that the door is closed. The world has changed. Even the genes of the gods must now decay. This is a profound statement, and it is delivered not as a theological assertion, but as a simple fact about the nature of the post-flood world. The pre-flood world was different. The post-flood world operates by different rules, and the families who survived the catastrophe, who carried within them whatever concentration of the original inheritance still existed, were the bridge between those two worlds. They were the custodians of a diminishing flame, and they knew it. Now let us follow the dynasties. After Kish, power moved. The Sumerian king list tracks 12 major dynasties in the post-flood period, and the pattern that emerges across all of them is consistent enough to be remarkable. The first dynasty of Kish gives us Etana, a king whose legend is specific and strange. His city was prosperous, his rule was stable, but his wife was barren. The royal bloodline faced extinction, and Etana's response to this crisis was not to take a second wife, not to adopt an heir, not to find a political solution. He rode an eagle into the heavens to beg for the plant of birth, a divine substance that would allow his wife to conceive. Strip away the mythological imagery and look at what remains. A king for whom the continuation of the correct lineage was so important that it justified the most extreme action imaginable. He did not go to heaven for wealth. He did not go for power. He did not go for wisdom or weapons or divine favor in battle. He went because his bloodline was at risk of ending, and that was the only crisis that warranted a direct appeal to the divine realm. The obsession with lineage, the morbid precision of genealogical record-keeping, the willingness to go to any length to preserve the specific inheritance of the ruling family. These are not incidental features of the Sumerian royal tradition. They are its central preoccupation. The second dynasty of Uruk gives us Gilgamesh, whom we have already met, but it also gives us his predecessor, Enmerkar, and his successor, Lugalbanda, and the pattern of divine human hybridization that runs through all of them like a thread. Each king's parentage is carefully recorded. Each king's divine credentials are specified. The fraction of divine inheritance is tracked across generations with the same precision applied to everything else. And then comes the first dynasty of Ur. And here, the archaeological record does something remarkable. It stops being abstract. Leonard Woolley's excavations at Ur in the late 1920s uncovered 16 royal tombs dating to roughly 2600 BCE. What he found inside them was not what he expected. Yes, there was gold. Yes, there was silver and lapis lazuli and carnelian, and objects of extraordinary craftsmanship. The lapis lazuli alone tells a story, because lapis lazuli does not come from Mesopotamia. It comes from a single source in the ancient world, the mines at Badakhshan, in what is now northeastern Afghanistan, more than 2,000 miles from Ur. The presence of lapis lazuli in the royal tombs of Ur is evidence of a trade network of staggering reach, a network that connected the river cities of Mesopotamia to the mountains of Central Asia, maintained by the same administrative precision that produced the king list. But there were also people, dozens of them. In the tomb of Queen Puabi, catalogue number P779, there were 74 attendants. They had not been killed. They had not been forced. They had walked down into the tomb, arranged themselves in orderly rows, and drunk poison. The cups were still near their hands. They had lain down and waited for death with a composure that suggests not coercion, but conviction. Consider what kind of belief system produces that kind of composure. If you genuinely believed, not as a metaphor, but as a literal fact about the nature of reality, that the person lying in the central burial chamber carried within their blood a substance of divine origin, a concentration of something that had descended from heaven and been passed through generations of careful preservation, then following that person into death was not madness. It was a rational calculation. It was the belief that proximity to that divine inheritance, even in death, conferred something that ordinary life could not. The attendants in Puabi's tomb were not sacrificed. They were volunteers. They were people who understood the theology well enough to make a deliberate choice about how to spend their deaths. The Mesopotamian understanding of the ruling class's blood was not symbolic. It was physical, metaphysical in the literal sense of the word, beyond the physical, but still real, still material, still capable of being inherited and measured and diluted and preserved. And this understanding did not stay in Mesopotamia. Here is where the story becomes genuinely strange, and where we need to follow the thread carefully. The civilizations that came after Sumer, that built on its foundations, that inherited its administrative traditions, its writing systems, its astronomical knowledge, and its political philosophy, they all inherited this too. The idea of divine bloodlines, the obsession with genealogical purity, the belief that the right to rule was not a matter of talent or achievement or popular will, but a matter of inheritance. Specifically, the inheritance of a quality that had been present in the ruling families since before the flood. In Babylon, the kings were the sons of Marduk, the chief god, in a genealogical sense that was understood literally. The great Babylonian creation epic, the Enuma Elish, was recited in full at the New Year festival, the Akitu, with the king playing the role of Marduk himself. This was not theatre. It was a ritual renewal of the divine inheritance, a ceremony designed to confirm and strengthen the divine substance in the royal bloodline for another year. The king who performed the ritual was not representing Marduk. He was, for the duration of the ceremony, Marduk. The divine and the royal were not metaphorically connected. They were understood to be literally the same substance in different concentrations. In Assyria, the royal inscriptions trace divine ancestry back through the pre-flood kings with the same precision as the Sumerian king list. The Assyrian king Shalmaneser, who ruled in the 9th century BCE, lists his ancestors in inscriptions that connect him, by name, to the pre-flood kings of the Sumerian tradition. He is not claiming metaphorical descent from a divine principle. He is claiming literal genealogical continuity with the families who received kingship when it first descended from heaven. In Egypt, the pharaoh was not merely chosen by the gods. He was the son of Ra, carrying divine substance in his body. His blood, a literal inheritance from the divine realm. The rituals of Egyptian kingship were not symbolic ceremonies. They were maintenance procedures for preserving and renewing the divine quality in the royal bloodline. The Seiyed festival, held after 30 years of a pharaoh's reign, was understood as a ritual renewal of the king's divine vitality, a ceremony that replenished whatever concentration of divine substance was present in his body. The Egyptians believed this substance could be depleted. They believed it required maintenance, and they developed an elaborate ritual technology for maintaining it. The same pattern appears in the Vedic tradition of ancient India, where the Kshatriya, the warrior ruler caste, traced their ancestry to the solar and lunar divine dynasties. The Mahabharata and the Ramayana, the great epics of the Hindu tradition, are at their core genealogical documents. They trace the lineages of their heroes back to divine origins with the same precision as the Sumerian king list, listing generation after generation of ancestors, specifying the divine parent at the root of the line and tracking the dilution of divine inheritance across the centuries. The heroes of these epics, like Gilgamesh, are hybrids, part divine, part human, extraordinary in their capabilities, mortal in their fate, caught between two natures, carrying within them the diminishing inheritance of a world that existed before the current age. In the traditions of ancient China, the emperor ruled by the mandate of heaven, a concept that began as a literal divine commission and became increasingly abstract over time, but which retained its essential logic of divine authorization for specific bloodlines. The Yellow Emperor, Huangdi, the legendary first emperor of China, was understood to have been born of a divine father. His descendants, the imperial families of Chinese history, trace their authority back to that original divine authorization. The mandate of heaven was not a metaphor for popular legitimacy. It was a claim about the nature of the emperor's blood, about what flowed in his veins that did not flow in the veins of ordinary people. In the ancient Near East, in the Mediterranean, in the Indus Valley, in the Yellow River Basin, the same idea appears in different forms but with the same underlying structure. Kingship descended from heaven, and the families who received it were obligated to preserve it. Now, let us be careful here, because this is the point where the evidence requires a particular kind of precision. There is a version of this story that claims direct, unbroken genealogical continuity from the Sumerian pre-flood kings to specific modern families. That version is not what the evidence supports. The historical record is far more complicated, far more fragmented, and far more interesting than a simple straight line from ancient Mesopotamia to the present. What the evidence does support is something subtler and perhaps more significant: the idea of divine bloodlines, the specific political theology that the Sumerians encoded in the king list, the belief that the right to rule is a matter of inherited divine substance rather than democratic selection or individual merit. This idea has shown a remarkable persistence across cultures and across millennia. It has been translated into different religious vocabularies, different mythological frameworks, different genealogical traditions. But the underlying structure, the logic of it, has survived in ways that are worth examining carefully. Consider the European royal tradition, which claimed divine right of kings as its foundational political theology well into the modern era. The divine right of kings was not, in its original formulation, a metaphor. It was a claim about the specific nature of royal blood, the belief that the monarchs of Europe carried within their lineages a divine authorization that could be traced back through the Christian tradition to the Old Testament kings, and through them to the Mesopotamian tradition from which the Old Testament drew so heavily. The connection between the Old Testament and the Mesopotamian tradition is not speculative. It is documented. The flood narrative in Genesis is structurally identical to the Sumerian flood narrative. The Garden of Eden narrative draws on Sumerian imagery of divine gardens and the tree of life. The genealogies of Genesis, with their impossibly long lifespans, their systematic decline from antediluvian centuries to post-flood decades, their obsessive tracking of who begat whom across generations, these are the same genre of document as the Sumerian king list. They are performing the same function. They are establishing genealogical credentials. They are tracing the legitimate line of inheritance from the original divine authorization down to the present. When the Hebrew Bible traces the lineage of King David back to Adam, and when the New Testament traces the lineage of Jesus back to David, these are not literary flourishes. They are genealogical arguments. They are claims about the nature of divine inheritance. They are documents in the same tradition as the Weld-Blundell Prism, pressed in different medium, written in a different language, but making the same fundamental claim. Kingship descended from heaven, and the families who received it are still here. The genealogical obsession of European royalty, the elaborate record-keeping of bloodlines, the careful management of marriages to preserve and concentrate specific inheritances, the horror at the prospect of the wrong blood entering the royal line. These are not coincidentally similar to the Sumerian obsession with genealogical purity. They are its direct descendants, transmitted through the intermediary traditions of the ancient Near East, through Babylon and Assyria and Persia and Greece and Rome and the early Christian Church, arriving at the medieval courts of Europe already ancient, already carrying the weight of thousands of years of accumulated belief. The 8 major royal families that still exist in Europe today: the British royal family, the Spanish, the Dutch, the Belgian, the Danish, the Norwegian, the Swedish, the Luxembourgish, they are all genealogically related to each other. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is a documented historical fact. They share common ancestors. They have maintained their networks of intermarriage across centuries. And if you trace those genealogies back far enough, they converge on the same points in medieval European history, and those points connect through the genealogical traditions of the Catholic Church and the Byzantine Empire to the royal traditions of the ancient Near East. The thread is long. It is frayed in places. It is tangled and knotted and sometimes impossible to follow with certainty. But it does not break. And then there are the banking families. The connection between the Sumerian administrative tradition and the origins of modern finance is not metaphorical. It is direct. The Sumerians invented compound interest. They invented the concept of the loan. They invented the institutional management of large pools of capital for the purpose of generating more capital. The temples of Mesopotamia were not merely religious institutions. They were banks. They held grain reserves. They issued loans. They charged interest. They maintained the financial infrastructure of the civilization. And the families who managed those temples, the priestly families, the administrative families, the scribal families who maintained the records, were often the same families who maintained the genealogical records of the ruling elite. The connection between financial power and political legitimacy is not a modern invention. It is baked into the foundations of civilization, literally pressed into the clay tablets that recorded both the king list and the grain inventories. Power over resources and power over people have been administered by the same hands since the beginning of recorded history. We have clay tablets from Mesopotamia that record loans made by the temples to farmers at the beginning of the planting season, with interest to be paid at harvest. We have tablets recording the transfer of land, the settlement of debts, the foreclosure of property when loans could not be repaid, the administrative technology of modern banking, the interest rate, the promissory note, the deed of property, the contract of debt. All of it originates in the same scribal tradition that produced the king list. The same people who tracked the genealogies of the divine bloodlines were tracking the flow of capital through the economy. The same precision that was applied to the question of who had the right to rule was applied to the question of who owed what to whom. The banking dynasties that emerged in medieval Europe, the Medici, the Fugger, the families that would eventually give rise to the Rothschilds and the other great financial houses, they emerged from the same tradition of temple banking that the Sumerians had established. The specific individuals are different. The genealogical connections are not direct in any simple sense, but the institutional logic, the idea that certain families are the custodians of the financial infrastructure of civilization, that this custodianship is a matter of inherited expertise and inherited networks rather than open competition. This logic has its roots in the same Mesopotamian soil as the king list. And here is where we need to be careful again, because the evidence invites a particular kind of clarity. The claim that 12 specific bloodlines secretly control the entire world, that there is a hidden council of ancient families pulling every string of every government and every economy. That claim is not what the evidence supports. It is a simplification that makes the actual story less interesting rather than more. What the evidence supports is something more nuanced and in some ways more unsettling. The structures of power that the Sumerians developed, the administrative systems, the financial systems, the political theologies, the genealogical obsessions, these structures have shown an extraordinary persistence. Not because a secret cabal has maintained them through hidden control, but because they work. They are effective technologies of power, and effective technologies of power tend to be adopted, adapted, and preserved by whoever holds power, regardless of their specific bloodline. The divine right of kings was not maintained for 4,000 years because a secret family forced everyone to believe it. It was maintained because it solved a problem. The problem of legitimacy. The problem of why this person, rather than that person, should hold authority over others. The Sumerian answer, that kingship descended from heaven and was carried in specific bloodlines. was an extraordinarily effective answer to that problem. It made the question of succession seem like a natural fact rather than a political choice. It placed the authority of the ruler beyond the reach of popular challenge. You cannot vote against someone whose right to rule is encoded in their blood. You cannot argue with a genealogy that traces back to the gods. And versions of that answer have been deployed in different vocabularies and different mythological frameworks by ruling classes across the world and across time, because it continues to solve the same problem. The question is not whether a specific set of 12 families has maintained unbroken control since the Sumerian period. The question is whether the political theology that the Sumerians encoded in the king list, the belief that legitimate authority is a matter of inherited divine substance rather than democratic selection, has continued to shape the structures of power in ways that are still visible today. And the answer to that question is yes. Demonstrably, documentably yes. Consider the language of modern political legitimacy. We have largely abandoned the explicit vocabulary of divine bloodlines. We speak instead of democratic mandates, of popular will, of constitutional authority. But look at the structures beneath the language. The families that hold concentrated financial power in the modern world are not primarily the product of open competition. They are the product of inheritance, of networks, of the accumulated advantage, of generations of careful management of wealth and connection. The Sumerian scribes who maintained the genealogical records of the ruling elite were performing in a different vocabulary, the same function as the lawyers and accountants and financial advisors who maintain the inherited wealth structures of modern elite families. The obsession with bloodline has not disappeared. It has been translated into the language of inherited capital, inherited networks, inherited social position. The divine substance that the Sumerians believed flowed through the veins of their kings has been replaced in the modern imagination by inherited advantage, by the compounding of wealth and connection across generations. The logic is the same, the vocabulary is different, and this is perhaps the most significant thing the Sumerian king list has to tell us. Not that 12 specific families have secretly controlled the world since before the flood. Not that the Rothschilds are the direct descendants of Gilgamesh. Not that the British royal family carries the literal genetic inheritance of the pre-flood kings of Eridu. These claims are not what the evidence supports, and they are not what the story requires. What the story requires, what the clay tablets pressed with their wedge-shaped marks are actually saying across 4,000 years of silence, is that the structures of power we inhabit are not natural. They are not inevitable. They are not the product of open competition or democratic selection, or the simple victory of the talented over the mediocre. They are the product of specific decisions made by specific people in specific historical moments, decisions that were encoded in clay and transmitted across generations and adapted into new vocabularies and new institutional forms, but which retain, beneath all the adaptations, the same fundamental logic. Kingship descended from heaven, and the families who received it have been working ever since to make sure it stays with them. This is not a conspiracy theory. Conspiracy theories require secret knowledge, hidden chambers, coded messages. What the Sumerian king list offers is something far more straightforward. It is an official document. It was meant to be read, It was meant to be copied and preserved and transmitted. The Sumerians were not hiding their political theology. They were broadcasting it. They pressed it into clay precisely because clay is permanent. Because what is pressed into clay survives floods and fires and the collapse of civilizations. They wanted us to know this, and perhaps that is the strangest thing of all. Let us return to the flood, because the flood is the hinge on which everything turns. The geological evidence for a catastrophic flood in southern Mesopotamia around 2900 BCE is real. The mud layer is real. The break in occupation is real. And the cultural memory of that catastrophe, encoded in the Sumerian flood stories and transmitted into the Babylonian epic of Atrahasis and eventually into the Genesis narrative of Noah, is one of the most widely distributed cultural memories in human history. Versions of a great flood story appear in traditions from Mesopotamia to India to Greece to Mesoamerica to the Pacific Islands. The specific details differ. The underlying structure, a catastrophic flood, a single family of survivors, a divine mandate to preserve and continue, is remarkably consistent. The Sumerian version is the oldest we have in written form. And in the Sumerian version, the flood is not primarily a story about divine punishment or human sin. It is a story about the management of a transition. The world that existed before the flood was one thing. The world after the flood was another. And the task of the survivors, the family of Ziusudra, the Sumerian flood hero, was to carry the essential inheritance of the pre-flood world into the post-flood world and maintain it there. Ziusudra did not merely survive, he was elevated, given immortality, made the ancestor of the new humanity. And his descendants, the post-flood kings, were understood to carry within them the concentrated inheritance of the pre-flood world, diluting generation by generation as it mixed with ordinary human blood, but never entirely disappearing. The flood in this reading is not a story about destruction. It is a story about continuity, about what survives catastrophe and how, about the mechanisms by which essential knowledge use and essential inheritance are preserved across the breaks in history. And this is a question that deserves more attention than it typically receives. How does knowledge survive catastrophe? The Sumerians had an answer. You press it into clay. Clay survives flood and fire. Clay survives the collapse of civilizations. Clay survives the 4,000 years between the moment a scribe pressed a reed stylus into wet mud near the city of Larsa and the morning in 1922 when Herbert Weld-Blundell lifted it out of the dust. The choice to encode the most important information in the most permanent medium available was not accidental. It was a deliberate technology of preservation. But the Sumerians also had another answer. You encode it in bloodlines. You preserve it in the bodies of specific families. You manage the inheritance carefully through the selection of marriage partners, through the obsessive genealogical record-keeping, through the political theology that makes the preservation of specific bloodlines a sacred obligation rather than a personal preference. The body is also a medium for the preservation of information across time. Whether that information is genetic in the biological sense, whether the Sumerians were tracking something that we would recognize today as a genetic inheritance, is a question that cannot be answered with certainty from the available evidence. But the logic of what they were doing is clear. They believed that something essential, something that had descended from heaven, and been present in the original rulers of Eridu could be preserved in bodies across generations if those bodies were managed carefully enough. And they were not alone in this belief. The Egyptian tradition of royal incest, the practice of pharaohs marrying their sisters or daughters, was not a cultural quirk or a political convenience. It was a deliberate strategy for concentrating divine inheritance. If the pharaoh carried divine blood and his wife also carried divine blood, their children would carry more divine blood than if the pharaoh had married a commoner. The logic is the same logic that produces the declining numbers in the Sumerian king list, but run in reverse. Rather than accepting the dilution of divine inheritance, the Egyptian tradition attempted to reverse it, to concentrate it, to maintain the highest possible ratio of divine to human in the royal bloodline. The same logic appears in the European royal tradition of endogamy, the preference for marriage within the same narrow circle of royal families. The Habsburgs, the most extreme practitioners of this strategy in European history, maintained their intermarriage practices for so long that the genetic consequences became visible in the famous Habsburg jaw, a physical marker of the accumulated inheritance of a family that had been managing its bloodline with the same obsessive precision as the Sumerian scribes. The Habsburg jaw is, in a very literal sense, the physical residue of a political theology that began on a clay tablet in ancient Mesopotamia. It is the mark left on a body by 4,000 years of the same idea, applied generation after generation, with the same conviction that the Sumerian priests applied to their genealogical records. You can see it in the portraits. You can see it in the skulls that archaeologists have examined. You can read it in the genetic studies that have been done on the remains of the Habsburg line. The idea pressed itself into the clay of their bodies and stayed there, visible and permanent, just as the wedge-shaped marks stayed visible in the clay of the prism. Now, let us consider the 12. The Sumerian king list records 12 major dynasties in the post-flood period. The number 12 is not arbitrary. The Sumerians organized their understanding of the cosmos around the number 12 in multiple overlapping systems. 12 major gods in the Mesopotamian pantheon, 12 months in the calendar, 12 signs in the zodiac, which the Sumerians developed. The number 12 represented completeness, the full cycle of a system, the total set of something. 12 dynasties, in this context, is not a count of the dynasties that happen to exist. It is a statement about the structure of legitimate power. The 12 dynasties are the complete set of legitimate ruling families, the families that carry the inheritance of the original kingship that descended from heaven. Other families might seize power, other cities might dominate for a period, but the king list maintains its focus on these 12 because they are the ones with the genealogical credentials, the ones whose claim to rule is legitimate in the deepest sense the Sumerians understood. And the number 12 has shown a persistence in the structures of power that is worth noting carefully. 12 tribes of Israel, 12 apostles, 12 knights of the Round Table, 12 peers of France, 12 members of the College of Cardinals that elects the Pope, 12 members of the Supreme Court that some have proposed. The number 12 appears again and again in the organizational structures of legitimate authority across cultures and across time, always carrying the same implication of completeness, of the full set, of the authorized total. Whether this is coincidence or cultural transmission is a question the archive cannot answer with certainty. But the pattern is there, and patterns in the structures of power deserve attention. What mysteries do you find yourself returning to? The ones that refuse to resolve no matter how much you read? Leave them in the comments. The archive collects those too, and sometimes the questions others are carrying point towards something none of us have found alone. The claim that 12 bloodlines rule the world today is a simplification of a more complex reality, but the underlying observation it points toward is not without substance. The concentration of political and financial power in the modern world is not random. It is not the product of open competition. It is the product of accumulated advantage, of inherited networks, of the compounding of wealth and connection across generations, of the persistence of structures that were designed thousands of years ago to ensure that power stays with specific families. The specific families have changed. The specific individuals are different. The genealogical connections are not direct in any simple sense. But the logic of the system, the idea that legitimate authority is a matter of inherited substance rather than democratic selection, has not changed as much as we like to think. We live in democracies. We believe in meritocracy. We tell ourselves that the best rise to the top, that talent and effort determine outcomes, that the playing field is level, or at least levelable. But the evidence of who actually holds concentrated power, who actually sits at the top of the structures that shape the world, who actually makes the decisions that determine the conditions of everyone else's lives, that evidence tells a different story. A story that looks, in its broad outlines, remarkably similar to the story encoded on a clay prism. In Oxford, kingship descended from heaven, and it has been staying there ever since. This is not a comfortable observation, but it is not meant to be alarming. The archive does not deal in alarm, it deals in illumination. And what the Sumerian king list illuminates, if we are willing to look at it carefully, is not a secret conspiracy, but a persistent structure. A structure that was built in the ancient world, that has been maintained and adapted across millennia, and that continues to shape the world we live in. The question the king list leaves us with is not whether we are being controlled by ancient bloodlines. The question is what we do with the understanding that the structures of power we inhabit are not natural, not inevitable, not the product of open competition, but the product of specific historical decisions that were made long before any of us were born, and that have been maintained in different vocabularies and different institutional forms ever since. That is a question worth sitting with in the dark. Let us return one more time to the object itself. The Weld-Blundell Prism sits in Oxford behind its panel of protective glass. Most people walk past it. The museum is busy with other things, other objects, other stories. The prism is small and brown and unremarkable to the eye that does not know what it is looking at. But if you stop, if you look closely enough to see the wedge-shaped marks pressed into its surface, 400 lines of them, sharp and resolute after 4,000 years. If you know enough to understand that what you are looking at is not a poem or a prayer, but an official record, an audit, a list maintained with the obsessive precision of people who invented writing for the purpose of tracking assets. If you understand that the first line of that record is a claim about the nature of political authority that has been deployed in different forms by ruling classes across the world and across time, right up to the present moment. Then the prism becomes something different. It becomes a mirror, a 4,000-year-old mirror in which we can see, if we are willing to look, the reflection of our own present. Kingship descended from heaven. The same families, the same logic, the same obsessive management of inheritance, the same political theology, translated into new vocabularies but retaining its essential structure. The same fundamental claim that the right to rule is not a matter of democratic selection or individual merit, but a matter of what flows in your blood. The Sumerians pressed this into clay because they wanted it to survive. They wanted us to know it. They wanted the record to be permanent. And it is. 4,000 years later, the marks are still sharp. The record is still legible. The claim is still being made in boardrooms and palaces and the quiet offices where the real decisions are made. The question is whether we are paying attention. Perhaps that is what the prism has always been waiting for. Not a scholar with a magnifying glass and a translation dictionary. Not a museum visitor with a guidebook, but someone willing to stand in front of it in the dark and hear what it is actually saying. The flood swept over, and then kingship descended from heaven again, and again, and again, through 12 dynasties and 40 centuries, and every catastrophe that history has thrown at the structure. It keeps coming back. It keeps descending. It keeps landing in the hands of the same kind of people. The people who know the genealogies, who maintain the records, who understand that the right to rule is not something you earn, but something you inherit and preserve and pass on. The clay remembers what we have forgotten, and maybe that is the most important thing the Owl Archive has to offer tonight. Not the specific names, not the specific bloodlines, not the conspiracy or the secret or the hidden truth, but the simple documented 4,000-year-old fact that the structures of power we inhabit were designed by specific people for specific purposes, and that those purposes have not changed as much as we like to think. The Weld-Blundell Prism is not mythology. It is not a fairy tale. It is an administrative document pressed into clay by people who understood that the most important things need to be preserved in the most permanent medium available. They were right. It survived. It is still there, and it is still speaking in its quiet, precious, obsessive way to anyone willing to stand still long enough to listen. The night shift is almost over. The archive is beginning to close its files one by one, the way the darkness softens just before dawn, not disappearing, but settling into a different quality of stillness. The clay tablets are quiet again. The museum halls are empty. The prism sits behind its glass, patient as it has always been, carrying its 400 lines of wedge-shaped truth into another morning. If you find yourself awake on a quiet night when sleep will not come, let this one play again. The layers have a way of revealing themselves differently the second time, when the mind is still and the dark is deep. And if someone in your life carries this same restless curiosity about the hidden architecture of the world, send this to them. Every time one of these forgotten histories finds a new listener, something that was meant to be buried gets a little harder to ignore. That is not a small thing. Somewhere in the world right now, the people who understand the genealogies are awake. They are always awake. They have always been awake, in one form or another, since before the flood swept over and kingship descended a second time. They know what the prism says. They have always known. And now, in the small hours of this particular night, so do you. The memory survives every flood. It finds a way into clay, into blood, into the structures of institutions that outlast the people who built them. What was pressed into the mud of ancient Mesopotamia is still pressing, still shaping, still descending, generation by generation, from whatever heaven it came from. The question of what to do with that knowledge, that is not a question for the archive. That is a question for the morning. For now, in the dark, it is enough to know. It is enough to have stood in front of the prism and heard what it was saying. It is enough to have followed the thread from Eridu to Kish to Ur to the present, and to have understood that the thread does not break. Let the understanding settle now, the way silt settles after a flood, slowly, evenly, covering everything with a thin layer of what has passed. Let the names and the numbers and the dynasties drift down into the quiet part of your mind where the deep things live. Let the prism sit in its museum, patient and brown and the colour of dried blood, carrying its message into another night. Kingship descended from heaven, and in the morning it will still be there. But for now, the archive is quiet. The files are closed. The night shift is done. Sleep well. The tablets will still be here when you wake. There is one more door worth opening before you rest. The archive has another file on what lies beneath the Sphinx at Giza, the sealed chambers Egypt has never allowed excavators to fully enter, and the question of what knowledge was buried there deliberately and why. The same logic of hidden inheritance runs through it. That video is waiting for you.